Welcome back to Videos from the Ville. This is Professor Greenewalt, and this is Public Administration and Public Service. We're finishing our first video, which was on microeconomics, and we're going to take a look at some of the final concepts involving microeconomics. We want to look at elasticity, we want to look at public good, externalities, and then what are the appropriate cases according to the British School of Welfare Economics where government, where it makes sense for government to intervene in societal affairs. And we find, in fact, again, we go back to the basic question of public administration, and that is, what should government do? What should government do in society? When should it do it? How much of it should they do? And I hope that those 7 examples will at least give you a start of something to think about. You can accept it, you can reject it, you can modify it, but I'm not going to leave you hanging in the lurch with no answer to the question of what should government do and when should they do it. Well, let's take a look for a moment at the concept of elasticity. We were looking at the concepts of supply and demand. What is elasticity? Elasticity is the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded. It's the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded. You find that we can have something called perfectly inelastic demand, or we can have a perfectly elastic demand. A perfectly inelastic demand is one where it doesn't matter what the price of the good or service is, the consumer is always going to demand the same amount. When does that ever happen in society? So here you, on this vertice, this axis, we would have price. On this axis, we would have quantity. And our demand curve would be straight up and down. And that would mean, that would show that we are always at the same quantity. But it's even though we're at the same quantity, it doesn't matter what the price is. We're consuming the same amount. What good or service is there that we ever deal with that would have that type of demand curve? Well, if you think about it long enough, you realize that it's only things really that have to do with life and death. For example, if you are diabetic and you need insulin to stay alive, it doesn't matter what the price of the insulin is, you're willing to pay the price or you'll lose your life. So that would be an example of a perfectly inelastic demand. This would be an HIV patient that needs the cocktail, for example. Now we have other drugs, but needs a cocktail to stay alive. It doesn't matter what the price of that drug or those drugs cost. You're going to pay that to stay alive. Another example of perfectly inelastic demand would be, for example, if you're a heroin addict or a cocaine addict. Again, it doesn't matter what the price of the heroin or the cocaine is. You'll simply stay on the streets long enough to rob enough people, steal enough hubcaps so that you have enough money to pay for that next hit of cocaine or heroin. Perfectly inelastic demand. Then we have in the case of the perfectly elastic demand, and this is simply, here is the price axis, and on the bottom is the quantity axis. And we find it from the price axis, and we find at some price level, the demand curve just goes straight across. What does that mean? That means that at that price on the price axis, whatever it might be, say it's $3, so long as the good or the service is $3 or less, we can sell as much of it as we can manufacture. If we go to $3.01, we can't sell any of it. Now, what in the world would have a demand curve that would resemble that? A demand curve that would be perfectly elastic. There's really only one good example, and That is found at Roots Market on Tuesday nights. I believe it's Tuesday. Wonderful marketplace between Mannheim and Landisville. And that would be agricultural produce, when we have fruits, fresh fruits or fresh vegetables. For example, I've gone to Roots many times with the idea that I will pay, I don't want to pay any more than $1.50 for a cantaloupe, and I won't spend any more than $3 for a watermelon. So long as I can find watermelon for $3, I'll buy as many as I can fit in the car. But if the price is $3.01, I'll go over and I'll buy a honeydew melon instead. So that is an example of a perfectly elastic demand curve. Well, this takes us on to several other principles here. Let's take a look at something called a public good. What is a public good? A public good, you'll hear this expression from time to time, and I want you to know exactly what it is. It is an expression that tends to be used and used accurately more frequently in economics than is true in political science. A public good is something that is desirable, something that is non-divisible, something that is non-excludable. It's something that's too expensive for individuals to provide for themselves. Theoretically, there's only one true public good. What do you think it might be? The one true public good, according to economists, would be national defense. National defense is desirable. It's not divisible. I can't give you so much of national defense and your neighbors so much. It's non-excludable. We all can partake of it. And it's too expensive for individuals to provide for themselves. You might be Bill Gates and you can buy a few tanks, but you can't provide a whole Army, Navy, and Air Force for yourself. So a public good, we're going to use, even though there's only one true public good, national defense, we're going to use the term in a less rigid way. We're going to use the term in a looser way, so that public goods will apply to our roadway system. See, our roadway system, we could exclude people from that, a turnpike being an example of this. The roadway system might meet all the other criteria, but we can exclude people from it. But we're not, we're going to use the phrase of public good a little bit less stringently. So we'll use the term public good to refer to concert halls, libraries, roadways, sewage treatment plants, were all examples of, for example, public goods. Now we want to move to something called an externality. What is an externality? An externality is also called a spillover. So spillovers and externalities are the same thing. And spillovers or externalities are the difference between private cost and social cost. The difference between private and social costs. And you find that spillovers can be both negative and they can be positive. They can be negative or they can be positive. An externality, and I want you to remember that definition absolutely on word for word. The difference between private and social costs. The difference between private and social costs. Let's take a look at a externality. You find that when my family moved to North Anvil, we were a mile away as the crow flies from Millard limestone plant. When the lime plant was built in North Anvil Township in Lebanon County, we find it was built at a place where where we have the purest limestone in the world. They have the highest concentration of calcium carbonate, I believe, that goes into the stone. It's the finest limestone in the world is right there. And so Mr. Millard built the largest lime kiln. Maybe at the time it was finished, by the time it was the third largest lime kiln in the world. No, I'm wrong. I got this wrong. It was the largest lime kiln in the world in the 1930s when he built it. Now it's the third largest lime kiln in the world. That's what it is. I'm sorry. Well, at any rate, when he made lime, we dug up big chunks of limestone. Eventually, those chunks of limestone are crushed and processed into powder and made into lime, and then sold for various building products or for agricultural production. Well, we find when in the 1960s, before the Clean Air Act, we find that we go outside in the morning and everything would be covered with a small light film of white, and it was lime from the processing plant. The processing plant wasn't taking care of all of its effluent itself and was throwing it out for the general public to have to bear part of the production costs. And you find that the plants loved it and they had lots of lime, but the thin layer of lime would eat away paint from the cars, from the homes. It could eat away your clothing if you left it out on the clothing line overnight. So the general public was all bearing some of the cost for the production of lime at this time. You could say that lime sold for $70 a ton at that point. After the Clean Air Act was passed, you find that this effluent levels had to be decreased, and Millard Limestone had to pay the full cost of producing their product. So now, rather than being able to sell a ton of lime for $70, they could sell a ton of lime for $80. So what was happening before, when they could sell it for $70, is the product that was being made required that the public would bear $10 a ton of the cost of producing. Because originally they could sell it for $70, now they're selling it for $80. So the public was bearing that extra $10 price in the term of this, what we would say is pollution. So what is the way? Well, that's a negative externality. Pollution is a negative externality. Okay, pollution is a negative externality. We can also talk about positive externalities. A positive externality would be, it's the 1960s. The Susquehanna River is very polluted. There's a whole line, this is all true, a whole line of manufacturing plants up and down the Susquehanna River. But we find that in many instances, these plants had to take in water. They would use the cool water to cool off some of their machinery, and then they'd return the water to the Susquehanna. Well, what happened in many instances, the water that they would take out of the Susquehanna to cool off some of their own machinery before they put the water back in the Susquehanna, they would take out polluted, dirty water. They would use it, and then they would filter it, and they'd put it back. And when they put it back, the water was cleaner than the water that they took out. So here society is benefiting from having cleaner water and not paying for it. That factory is paying for it. So that is called a positive externality. So we had negative externalities, and here's a positive externality. So they can go both ways. What are the ways to control externalities? Well, we can either tax. We tax a company if they're throwing out too much pollution, for example. So we can tax it, or we can regulate it. We can rule and regulate it and say that they're just not allowed to do that. So that's the only way to take care of negative externalities. We mostly tend to think of negative ones. We can tax it, or we can regulate it. Okay? So those are externalities. Lastly, we want to look at the answer to the question that I posed at the beginning, and that is, When should government intervene in society? Well, as we said before, there are 13 good answers to this when we could intervene in the affairs of society. Actually, I'm wrong. Excuse me. I'm going to give you 7 good instances where we find that the answer to this school was ultimately provided by the British School of Welfare Economics. Now, some may think it's a perfect answer, some may not, but at least it gives you a place to start. What are the 7 instances where government should intervene in the affairs of society? Well, the British School of Welfare Economics tells us number 1 would be consumer ignorance. When something like thalidomide is developed. Thalidomide was a pregnancy drug for women in the 1950s, and we find it did get women pregnant, but it also resulted in many birth defects for the children. So once we discovered that, then it's only right for government to intervene, for government to announce to the people that do not take thalidomide because of the possible birth defects. Another instance where it's all right for government to get involved is, for example, dealing with externalities. If we want to get rid of those negative externalities, again, we should have government be involved with regulation or taxation. So government can intervene when there's consumer ignorance. Government should intervene when there's externalities. How about when we need public goods? Government has to provide them. How about when we have the immobility of factors of production? In some instances, well, I'll tell you what, let me cover that last. We have externalities, we have public goods. How about the redistribution of societal resources? In some instances, we find that, in El Salvador, you have something like 90% of all the land being owned by less than 10% of the people. I don't want to sound socialistic or Marxist here at all. I certainly am anything but that. But you find that in a case like that, it's ripe for revolution, and so you may look to try to redistribute some resources so that that area is not going to be ripe for a revolution, that the government isn't going to be ultimately overthrown very quickly because of that. So the redistribution of resources would be another instance where maybe government should be involved. We find that government might also want to be involved, as we said, for the protection of some vulnerable population segment. The very, very old, the very, very young, the very old, very young, or the physically or psychologically, mentally handicapped would be another example of where government should be involved. Consumer ignorance, one other instance would be monopoly. Government should be involved where there has to be a monopoly. We have, for example, monopolies necessary in the area, for example, of public utilities. So we have the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission to deal with that. So it's done properly and doesn't favor one business over the other. Consumer ignorance, monopoly, redistribution of resources, protection of vulnerable population segments, public goods, externalities, and lastly, the immobility of the means of production. Well, of course, we know that factors of production are what? Land, labor, and capital. Well, let's say land, labor, and capital. Labor. Let's say this is why we have the unemployment compensation run by the government. If one of you loses your job, You have had traditionally up to a year on unemployment, and that unemployment money was given to you so that you could be retrained if you wanted to be for another job, or you could move to another area. The fact of the matter is that labor, we tend to think that someone's fired, they can just pack up and move to another place where there's jobs. It's not true because they did have a home, they have to sell the home, they would have a spouse perhaps, and the spouse gets a say, and where does she work or he work? You have children that might be in school, so you need that extra time and that money to prepare for transfer or relocation to another area. So the immobility factors of production, um, you have land, labor. So we had labor, and we had capital. The last would be land. Land. The immobility factors of production. Land. Obviously, land isn't mobile. One of the best examples of why government had to come in to deal with this issue of the immobility of land could be seen on Route 61, north of Frackville, Pennsylvania. Of course, I'm referring to that little community of Centralia. Centralia once was a community that was almost like Mount Joy here in Lancaster County. It was a nice-sized town, a thriving town, but coal was the major industry there, and the coal mines, as we turned more and more to natural gas, coal as a heating source for our homes started to diminish, and the coal mines were closing, and people started to throw their garbage down abandoned coal mines. Well, in the first half of the 1960s, one of those coal mines with all the garbage in caught fire underneath Centralia. This is the largest seam of anthracite coal in the world, running between Shamokin and Hazleton. Shamokin on the Susquehanna River, and Hazleton on the Delaware. You find that this coal mine caught on fire. The seam of coal is on fire. Local authorities tried to put it out and couldn't. State authorities tried to put it out and couldn't. So next we go to Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Department of Interior came and took a look of it. They took a look at it, and they couldn't deal with it easily either. They said they would have to dig a trench, a hole that would be deeper than the Empire State Building was high. So they chose not to do anything about it, and rather than dig that trench, they decided land isn't mobile, so government will come in and will buy all the houses of everyone. So they gave everyone more than their house was worth, and people took the settlements and fled to the four corners of the world. Find that there's still just a handful of people that still live there and refuse to accept the settlement, and they've stayed. But here's another instance where, yes, land is not very mobile, and so government came in and helped take care of this problem. So the immobility of the factors of production. This would be another possible area where government might want to be involved in the affairs of us in the day-to-day world. So the principles of microeconomics, I think this pretty much ties it together, and we can move ahead to what is public administration, and how do we approach it. Okay, I'll be back with that in the next video. I'll talk to you then.
That's good timing.
Show me how to do
this.
It's just present.
Yeah.
Just okay.
Okay.
All right, good.
Okay, we're rolling.
All right, thank you. Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Greenawalt, and this is Introduction to Public Administration and Public Service. Today we're going to talk about what is public administration. We're going to define public administration. What is it? Well, there's no easy definition of public administration because the term public administration has been used 4 different ways. We find that the term public administration has been used in a general fashion as a field of occupational activity. We find that the term public administration has been used as an academic discipline, as a branch of learning or instruction. We find that the term public administration has been used as a science, as a body of knowledge that's systematically arranged, that shows operations or laws. And we find that public administration has also been used as a profession or as a lifelong career. Now, how do we define profession? Frederick Mosier, one of my mentors at the University of Virginia, who is one of the trio of 3 major figures in the history of American public administration. Frederick Mosier has always been one of those most famous for his book Democracy in the Public Service. But Frederick Mosier, M-O-S-H-E-R, he defined professions for us. He had a way with words that many of us don't. He defined professions this way. In Democracy in the Public Service, he said that a profession is, quote, a social mechanism whereby knowledge, particularly new knowledge, is translated into action and service. They provide the means whereby intellectual achievement becomes operational. Don't you love that definition? They provide the means whereby intellectual achievement becomes operational. So that is Frederick Mosier's definition of a profession. What are the parts? What are the components of this definition? Well, Mosier would tell you that the components of this definition would, to be a professional means you have a career, number 1. So the components of a definition would include, number 1, a career, number 2, a degree of specialization in the kind of work that's performed, a degree of specialization in the kind of work that's performed. Number 3, you'd find that some degree of specialized education is required. Some degree of specialized education. Number 4, professional association with the national headquarters. And number 5, some degree of altruism. All those components need to be there to be considered a professional. So, as we move to definitions of public administration, we can turn to one of America's finest and foremost public administrators. He actually started his teaching career here at Millersville. He was a graduate of West Point. I believe he was on the track team and the football team. He served his military obligation with the U.S. Army, and then he went to the University of Michigan, where he got his doctorate. And after he got his master's and doctorate at Michigan, he came here. And Michigan is certainly one of the most famous, one of the best schools for political science in America. But here he taught a variety of subjects here, and being public administration and scope and methods, for example, and that's what I took him for. Grover Starling has taught for many, many years at the University of Houston at Clear Lake, where he's head of the Center for Competitiveness, the Center for Competition. Um, and they do much, much work with NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Grover Starling's written, I think, the single best book on public administration that's available, and I used to use it for this class. But every time the book was revised, every time the book was updated, it became much more complicated, if you will, much more in depth. And it got to the point where now I think it is still the best single book on public administration that the Academy has available to it, but that it needs to be used now for graduate school, not undergraduate school. Um, but his book is Managing the public sector, and then he wrote a fantastic introduction to American government as well. As we look at Grover Starling, what is his definition of public administration? His definition is that public administration comprises all those activities. Public administration comprises all those activities involved in carrying out the policies of elected officials and some activities associated with the development of those policies. So public administration comprises all those activities involved in carrying out the policies of elected officials and some activities associated with the development of those policies. Again, you'd be well advised to be following this video with your PowerPoints and your PowerPoint presentations that I sent to you. We find that some very great brothers, Felix and Lloyd Nigro, and some of their very excellent books in public administration. They have their own definition of public administration. How do they define it? Felix and Lloyd Nigro define public administration through 5 elements. They say public administration is comprised of the following things, and you can again follow this on your PowerPoints. 1 is a cooperative group effort in a public setting. A cooperative group effort in a public setting. Number 2, it covers all 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. Covers all 3 branches of government and their relationships. Number 3, it has an important role in the formulation of public policy, and thus is part of the political process. It has an important role in the formulation of public policy, and is thus part of the political process. Number 4, it's different in significant ways from private administration. It's different in significant ways from private administration. Number 5, it's closely associated with numerous private groups. It's closely associated with numerous private groups and individuals in providing services to the community. So number 5, it's closely associated with numerous private groups and individuals in providing services to the community. Now, another fantastic definition of public administration is given to us by Luther Gulick. Luther Gulick, G-U-L-I-C-K. G-U-L-I-C-K, Luther Gulick. He is another member of the trio of great American public administrators. Frederick Mosher, Luther Gulick, and Dwight Waldo was the third who had been has been with the Syracuse University. Syracuse University, which is considered to have the finest public administration program in America traditionally. But Luther Gulick defines public administration by what it consists of, and he uses an acronym. It's the most famous acronym in American public administration, and that is POSDECORB. POSDECORB. POSDECORB stands for planning. Think of things, verbs that all have to do with public administration. The P is planning. The O is organizing. The S is staffing, which would mean the hiring and firing and evaluation of people. Staffing. The D is directing. We have, I know, a COO, but we're just a CO. The CO is coordinating, coordinating. The R is reporting, and the B is one of the most important things, budgeting. So Luther Gulick says public administration is POSDECORB. The P is for planning, the O is organizing, the S is for staffing, the D is for directing, the CO for coordinating, the R for reporting, and the B for budgeting. POSDECORB. I hope that all of you will learn that quickly, so I call on anyone in class, you'd be able to recite that immediately. Of course, I can't call on you just in class in the way I traditionally could, can I? Well, does Grover Starling think that public administration could be a science? He says no, he does not think so. Why does he say this? Well, he believes that science developed and science is characterized by something that we refer to as paradigms. Paradigms are conceptual frameworks. The word paradigm was never heard much in society, and then Bill Clinton started to use it a few times, and it became fairly widespread. A paradigm is nothing more than a conceptual framework which tries to explain to explain some phenomena, just to explain some phenomena that we haven't gotten our a full hold on yet. So paradigm, a conceptual framework which explains and interprets phenomena. Um, so how does science develop? And what is it characterized by? We find that Grover Starling doesn't believe that public administration can be a science. And I'll talk about why in just a little bit. But you find that if we are going to look at public administration as a science, we need to define what a science is. And we're working on this. First of all, we are going to turn to Thomas Kuhn, K-U-H-N, K-U-H-N, Thomas Kuhn. He says that science develops and is characterized by paradigms, conceptual frameworks which explain phenomena. This whole idea was developed by Thomas Kuhn in a great book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn believes that science develops through the presence of anomalies. Anomalies are results from experiments that can't be explained by the accepted paradigm. These are exceptions to the paradigm. And if the number of anomalies grows and grows and grows, pretty soon the paradigm isn't going to be any good anymore, and we'll look for alternatives to that. And so this is how scientific revolutions occur. We find that the paradigms can no longer explain all the anomalies. We can't overlook that. And we find that when a paradigm comes about that can explain many of the anomalies, then we find that we have a scientific revolution. And we have a better explanation than the one we had before. We find that Grover Starling believes that public administration is in a pre-paradigm stage. He believes that it's in a stage where facts, opinions, and hypotheses are circulating, and they haven't been organized, they haven't been connected, and they don't need to be. Grover, does he want public administration to become a science? He says most adamantly, no, no, no. He thinks that public administration is concerned with what? It's concerned with trying to solve public problems. It's trying to improve the public interest, trying to improve the way that all of us live and work every day. So he believes that public administration needs to be concerned with real, pressing current problems, um, and the sooner we can solve them, the better. So Grover Starling says if you're a science, then you have to accept paradigms. If you accept paradigms, you limit your questions, for example. So if Starling doesn't want to treat public administration as a science, what does he want to treat it as? Well, he'd like to treat it as a profession. He'd like to treat it as a profession. And then we have other great public administrators such as Berkeley. Berkeley wants to treat public administration, for example, as a craft. As a craft. Well, how do we talk about public administration? How do we think about it? How do we consider it? We want to realize that the scope of public administration is very, very, very broad. It's impossible to write one book or one book of readings which will cover all aspects of public administration because the field of public administration is extraordinarily wide. Public administration contains information from political science, information from history, information from economics, information from psychology are all covered by this field of public administration. Well, over the years, we find too that the discipline of public administration has certainly broadened and it's widened and it's had its boundaries confused. How is that true? What has happened in society to do these things? What has happened in society to widen and confuse the boundaries of public administration? Well, there are 8 different factors. Let me share these with you. There are 8 different factors. Number 1, it's increasingly difficult, as Frederick Mosier would have told you, it's increasingly difficult to separate public and private spheres. We used to know that, the post office was completely public, no doubt about it. And now, over the years, we find that that's not necessarily the case, that now it has been, there's an attempt made to privatize it, but what is still true is that before the post office can change the benefit package for postal employees, change the pay, um, that they have to get permission from Congress. In order to change the rate for postage, they have to change get the permission of Congress. So the post office is both public and private, isn't it? So it's increasingly difficult to separate the public and private spheres. We find number 2, the separation of the powers in government has eroded. The separation of the powers in government has eroded. Number 3, the separation of the levels of government has eroded. We find that the separation of the levels of government has eroded. It used to be considered that education was a local government activity. And then under the administration, for example, of George Bush Jr., we find that the Bush administration, under the No Child Left Behind program, they wanted to come into the schools to try to help the local governments and the state governments make sure that all children could read. And now, all of a sudden, local governments and local schools, which had been used to settling their own problems, and that all of a sudden now federal officials were in local education and were trying to be of assistance. So the separation of the levels of government has eroded. Number 4, there used to be a separation in foreign and domestic affairs. That is no longer true. We see that disappearing some time ago. Um, for example, when 1980, we find that the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And what do we do in response? Well, we decide not to go to the Soviet Olympics and not to go to the Olympics in Moscow, and much of the free world followed suit. Um, you find that in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that we decided to impose a grain embargo on the Soviet Union, and that affected the farmers. The farmers weren't able to sell their grain to the Soviet Union as they normally could, so they had a glut of grain, and the price of grain went way, way down. So here, as the foreign affairs, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and how it affects the domestic price of wheat in the United States. So this separation of foreign and domestic affairs is no longer as clear as it once was. Um, you find that the dichotomy among government employees has eroded. Now it's harder to tell management from labor than it used to be. Um, the boundaries among the processes of government has eroded. Now if we're planning, we're budgeting. If we're budgeting, we're planning. That wasn't true in the past. You have an erosion between the different activities of government. Um, you find that now to try to discourage young people from engaging in a life of crime. For example, they have been taken into the prison system of New Jersey, and to scare them. I think that program was called Scared Straight. So here you have the Justice Department at a statewide level getting involved with the Educational Department for trying to engage in law enforcement, discouraging young people from engaging in a life of crime. So the erosion of the boundaries between different programs of government, that's disappeared. Well, the similarities, we go to the differences between public and private administration. Similarities are great because administration is a cooperative group effort. A cooperative group effort to solve problems or to attain goals. We find that many schools indeed have a generic schools have a generic school of administration. We had that at Ferrum College. We didn't have public administration. We didn't have private business administration. We just had a school of administration, and we combined public and private together. But the main distinction between public and private administration is the environment. Starling argues over and over again that the peculiar element in public administration is that everything that a government agency does is in essentially a goldfish bowl. Public officials can be viewed by everybody at any time. So we operate in a goldfish bowl. James Forrestal, you've all heard of the Forrestal class of naval ships, was named for him, being the first Secretary of Defense that we ever had after the Second World War. You had the merger of the Army Department, the Army and the Navy Department, along with the Army Air Force. And no, the Army Air Force, excuse me, becomes the Air Force, yes. But James Forrestal is the first person to head up this new department. At first they call it the Department of the Military Establishment. Very awkward name, and so very quickly it takes the name of the Department of Defense. And Jimmy Forrestal was one of the first and one of the brightest people to lead that department, but certainly the first as it becomes the Department of Defense. James Forrestal and there was a class of ships now that are named for him, Forrestal category of ships. But James Forrestal says, quote, "The difficulty of government work is that it not only has to be done well, but the public has to be convinced that it's being done well." So the difficulty of government work is that it not only has to be done well, but the public has to be convinced that it's being done well. So in other words, there is a necessity both for competence and for exposition. But there is a necessity both for competence and exposition, and he holds it extremely difficult to combine the two in the same person, unquote. And that is indeed why it's very difficult for many businessmen to excel in government, where everyone can see everything, or everyone's supposed to be able to see everything that you do. The difficulty in government work is that it not only has to be done well, you have to do it well, but you have to convince the public that it's being done well as well. So you have to be very good at what you do, and you have to be very good at explaining to the general public what you're doing. So in order to succeed in government, you have to do good work, but you have to convince the public that you're doing good work as well. Well, when we're looking at public and private administration, certainly some differences are the size and the diversity of activities. The government is different from the private sector because there's no private company around that can match the size of the federal government and the diversity of its activities. Government activities are on a much wider scope, and they can affect the entire economic and social structure of the country, such as, for example, it's the Federal Reserve that decides what the interest rate is going to be. The interest rate can affect the whole economy one way or the other. Very different. Public versus private administration, of course, many of us believe that the key difference between public and private administration is simply that government lacks a profit motive. They don't have to work efficiently because they can continue to exist even in the red. They don't need to make a profit. If they're operating at a loss, they can increase taxes, or they can move money from one program over to the other. Well, let's take a break right here, and we'll go on to the history of public administration, which will be next, the history of public administration. Let's take a break right here.